The town doctor raped me. And my mother, God rest her soul, she told the whole of Prosperity, Kansas, that the baby in my belly was a miracle, sent straight from heaven to protect him. My name is Fawn Anderson, and I've lived here for all of my 78 years. Most folks in town know me as the woman with the steady hands. These old, wrinkled hands have snapped a million green beans on my porch swing, and they've held the hands of the sick and the grieving at more bedsides than I can count. I'm the one they call when a new baby's born or an old neighbor's passed. They see a quiet widow, dependable as the seasons, a woman who's as much a part of this town as the limestone courthouse downtown. But this place, Prosperity, it's built on stories we all agree to believe. The wind that rolls through those endless wheat fields, making them bow and sway. People say it sounds like a prayer. But for as long as I can remember, it's always sounded like whispers to me. The big bell at the First Baptist Church rings out every hour, sharp and clear. For everyone else, it's just the time of day. For me, it's a hammer hitting an anvil, forging a lie that's held for over 60 years. Every polite mornin' fawn at the post office, every shared pew on Sunday. It's all just a pretty, hand-stitched quilt laid right over a patch of poisoned ground. I've carried this truth inside me for so long, it's grown roots around my heart. But a secret that heavy don't just sit there, it eats at you. It turns your memories into ghosts. So now, before I meet my maker, I'm going to pull back that quilt. I'm going to tell you the whole story, from the very beginning. The story of how a town savior became my own private devil, and how a mother's fear built me a gilded cage and called it a blessing. I'm not just telling you a tale to pass the time. I'm asking you to stand witness to a life that's been hidden from view. So I need to know, are you prepared to hear a truth that might break your heart a little? Can you sit with me in the dark while I finally turn on the light? If you can, then commit to hearing me out. Subscribe to my story, because your listening is the only justice I've ever had a chance at. Before that office, before the silence, my life was as simple and sweet as a slice of my mother's peach pie in the middle of a Kansas summer. Our world was small, held together by the rhythm of the seasons and the grace of God. I remember the smell of the earth right after a thunderstorm, so rich and clean you felt like the whole world had been washed anew. I remember the feeling of dust between my toes, soft as flour, as I ran down the dirt lane to the mailbox, hoping for a letter from my cousin. Life wasn't measured by a clock back then. It was measured by the height of the corn in my father's fields and the angle of the sun in the sky. Daddy was a quiet man, smelled of sunshine and good soil. He didn't say much, but when he laid his big, calloused hand on my shoulder, it felt like the safest place on earth. And Mama was the heart of our little house. Her love was in the scent of baking bread that filled every room, in the neat stitches of the patches on my overalls, in the way she'd hum old hymns while canning tomatoes, her hands moving so fast they were a blur. In that world, Dr. Miller wasn't a man. He was a landmark. He was as solid and necessary as the town water tower. In a place like Prosperity, where a bad winter could cut you off from the world for weeks, the town doctor is a kind of king. He'd delivered half the babies in the county, including me. He'd set my own brother's arm when he fell out of the old oak tree, his voice calm and steady while my mother wrung her hands. I remember one year the flu came through something awful. Dr. Miller went from house to house, his face gray with exhaustion, never stopping. People said he was a saint, that the man was kept going by prayer and sheer force of will. He had this way of looking at you, a kind of reassuring smile that made you feel like everything was going to be all right. But looking back now, with eyes that have seen too much, I can see the other things. The little seeds of darkness planted in all that good soil. I remember how his kindness always seemed to need an audience. He'd make a big show of letting the widow Hemlock pay for her medicine with a basket of eggs, announcing it to the whole waiting room so everyone could see his charity. And there were his hands. Everyone talked about his healing hands, but I remember once, at a church picnic, he put his hand on my arm to praise my needlepoint. It lingered just a second too long. It wasn't a doctor's touch. It was different, a feeling like a shadow passing over the sun. I brushed it off, of course. A silly girl's notion. He was Dr. Miller. He was safe. My mother, she trusted him with a faith that was absolute. Her trust in him was second only to her trust in the Lord. But her biggest fear, the thing that governed her whole life, was the judgment of others. Keep your head high and your apron clean, she'd always say. What people see is what you are. It wasn't a mean-spirited thing. It was just how she survived, how she'd been taught to navigate a world where a woman's reputation was as fragile as a robin's egg. We were a good family with a good name, and to her, that was a fortress we had to defend at all costs. I loved her so fiercely. We'd sit on the porch swing on long summer evenings, shelling peas into a big metal bowl between us, the plink, plink, plink of the peas hitting the bottom the only sound besides the crickets. I felt like I could tell her anything. I didn't know then that there was a secret so terrible she would choose the fortress of our family's name over the daughter inside it. The first domino fell in autumn. The air was getting crisp, and the leaves on the cottonwoods were turning that brilliant, heartbreaking yellow. I came down with a cough. It wasn't much, just a tickle in my throat that wouldn't go away. Or maybe it was a headache. It's funny, the things you forget. The mind puts a little fog over the path that leads to the worst day of your life. I remember Mama fussing, pressing the back of her hand to my forehead. But her worry felt different this time. I was 16, and my body was changing in ways that made her nervous. The revelation, the one that pricks at me now, is that the cough wasn't the real reason she sent me to him. She told me, "Fawn, you're almost a woman now. You need to go see the doctor by yourself. It's time you learned." She was so proud, trying to push her little bird out of the nest. She thought she was teaching me to be independent. What she did was walk me right up to the fox's den and leave me on the doorstep, thinking he would keep me safe. I walked up the steps to Dr. Miller's office with my mother's words echoing in my ears. "Be a grown-up now, Fawn." The bell above the door gave a tiny, lonely little jingle. The waiting room was empty. It must have been a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. His quietest day. Lord, the memory plays tricks with the edges of things, but I remember the quiet. It was a loud quiet, the kind that buzzes in your ears. The only real sound was the slow, heavy tock, tock, tock of the big clock on the wall, each tick counting down to something my innocent heart couldn't yet name. The air smelled sharp, of antiseptic and floor polish. A smell that was supposed to mean things were clean, safe. For 60 years now, that smell has made my stomach turn. He came out from his back office, wiping his hands on a towel, that familiar, reassuring smile already in place. It was the same smile he'd given me when he'd set my doll's leg with a popsicle stick and a bandage when I was 6. He told me he was proud of me for coming in by myself, that my mother was right, I was becoming a fine young woman. He said a girl as special as me needed special attention, that there were things about growing up that were delicate. He spoke in that low, calm voice, the one that had soothed 100 crying babies and calmed 1,000 fevers. And I, a 16-year-old girl who'd been taught that a doctor was second only to a minister, I soaked it all in. I was special. This was my secret initiation into womanhood, and he was my trusted guide. His words were like a warm blanket, and I didn't realize until it was too late that I was being wrapped up for the slaughter. What happened in that room? On that cold, paper-lined table? Some parts are a blur, like looking through old, wavy glass. My mind, in its mercy, has smudged the worst of it, but I remember the feeling. I remember the world tilting, the pattern on the ceiling tiles suddenly becoming the most important thing I'd ever seen. I remember the weight of the silence after he told me to be a good, quiet girl. He kept talking the whole time, his voice a low murmur about how this was our secret, a special understanding between us. A bond. He made it sound almost holy. He used words like trust and care, while he was tearing my world apart at the seams. It wasn't a violent storm. It was a quiet, cold flood that drowned me without making a sound. When it was over, he patted my hand, the very picture of kindness, and told me I was a brave girl and that our secret would keep me safe. I left his office in a daze. He'd asked me to wait in the examination room for a moment to compose myself. As I sat there, trying to make my hands stop shaking, I heard his wife, Mrs. Miller, come in through the back entrance. Her voice was sharp, like a splinter of glass. She was talking about some church fund, and he cut her off. "Not now, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and tight. "It's been a trying afternoon." And then she said something I'll never forget. "Did you have another one of your episodes? Like in Wichita?" There was a long silence. Then he told her, in a voice colder than a winter grave, to go home. Wichita. He had always told everyone he'd left a thriving city practice because he felt a calling to serve a small town like ours. He was a missionary in his own country. That's what he'd said. In that moment, hearing that one word, Wichita, a different story, a darker one, began to write itself in my mind. He wasn't a saint who chose us. He was a man who had run from something. I walked home under the same bright autumn sun, but the world had lost its color. The trees looked like gray skeletons. My own feet felt like they belonged to someone else. When I got home, Mama was pulling a sheet cake from the oven, and the warm, sweet smell rushed out to meet me. It almost made me sick. She asked how it went, and I heard a voice, my voice say, "Fine." He said, "It's just a little cough." The lie came so easily. It was the first brick in the wall I would spend the rest of my life building. That night, I lay in my bed and prayed for understanding. He was Dr. Miller, a healer, a man blessed by God. My 16-year-old mind couldn't hold the two things at once, that a man could be a savior to the town and a monster to me. So I made a choice. I told myself that the sin wasn't what he did. The sin was the shame I felt. The fault had to be mine. The weeks after that day in the doctor's office were a kind of gray fog. The autumn leaves fell, and the world outside my window prepared for winter. But inside our little house, a different kind of cold was setting in. I was sick. A deep, weary sickness that lived in my bones and turned my stomach at the smell of coffee in the morning. I told myself it was the cough, that it had settled deep in my chest. But a lie is a poor blanket when the truth is a bitter frost. The secret inside me was growing, making its presence known in ways I couldn't ignore, couldn't explain, and couldn't bear. The world I knew, the simple, predictable rhythm of my life, was slipping away. And my mother, she started to change. The hymns she used to hum while she worked faded into silence. The house grew quiet, except for the sound of her shoes on the linoleum, quick and nervous, like a mouse skittering away from a shadow. Her eyes were always on me, not with the soft warmth I'd known my whole life, but with a sharp, searching look, like she was trying to see through my skin to the rot underneath. My friends would come by, their laughter ringing out on the porch, and Mama would meet them at the door with a sad, tight smile. "Fawn's not feeling herself," she'd say. "She needs her rest." She told the preacher I had a lingering fever. She told my Aunt Carol it was female troubles. Little by little, with a quiet, desperate efficiency, she began to build a wall around me, brick by loving, terrified brick. My world, which had once been as wide as the Kansas prairie, shrank to the four walls of my bedroom. The scent of the house, once a comfort, now felt suffocating. I'd sit for hours at my window, watching the other girls walk home from school, their books clutched to their chests, their futures stretching out before them, clear and bright. Mine felt like a tangled mess of thread in the dark. I tried once, just once, to reach for her. I was helping her fold laundry, the clean, warm smell of lye soap all around us. I felt a wave of dizziness and leaned against the wall. I didn't say the truth. Lord, I didn't know how. But I whispered, "Mama, I'm so scared. I don't know what's wrong with me." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep maternal pain. For a heartbeat, I thought she would pull me close. But then it was gone, replaced by that hard, brittle fear. She just pressed a folded sheet into my hands and said, "There's nothing to be scared of. You just need to be strong. Now finish your chores." The real breaking point, the moment the wall around me became a sealed tomb, happened on a Sunday morning. The church bells were ringing, calling the faithful, and the smell of my father's frying bacon filled the house. A wave of nausea, so violent and sudden, hit me, and I collapsed onto the kitchen floor. My father rushed over, his face a mask of worry. But my mother just stood there. And when I looked up at her from the cold floor, I saw it all. There was no confusion in her eyes. There was no shock. There was only the cold, hard glint of recognition. She knew. I don't know how, but she knew. And in that awful, silent moment, I saw her mind working. Her first thought wasn't for her daughter, crumpled in a heap on the floor. Her first thought was of the neighbors, of the family name, of the terrible, impossible scandal. The plot twist wasn't what was happening to my body. It was seeing so clearly what was happening in her soul. She was no longer my mother. She was a general, facing a battle she had to win at any cost. She helped me to my feet, her grip like iron on my arm, and marched me back to my room. She didn't say a word. She just closed the door behind me, and I heard the soft, final click of the lock. It wasn't a real lock, just a little hook and eye latch we sometimes used when the wind was high. But in that moment, it sounded as loud as a prison gate slamming shut. I finally understood. I wasn't a sick daughter to be cared for. I was a secret to be contained. And the person I had trusted most in the world had just become my jailer. The days after the lock clicked shut, bled into one another, each one the same shade of gray as the one before. My life became a small, repeating pattern, governed by the silent rituals of my confinement. 3 times a day, there would be a soft knock on my door, and a tray would be placed on the floor. My mother's hands would appear for a moment in the gap, then vanish. Sometimes I'd see her shadow linger for a second, a dark, silent sentinel, before moving on. The war between us was not fought with angry words or slammed doors. It was fought with this terrible, crushing silence. A silence that screamed all the things we couldn't say: shame, terror, accusation, and a grief so deep it had no voice. At first, I tried to fight back. I'd refuse the food. I'd call out to her, my voice cracking, "Mama, please, just talk to me." But the only answer was the creak of the floorboards as she walked away. Slowly, I began to disappear. The girl who loved the smell of hay and the feel of a fast horse beneath her. She was a ghost. I'd look in the mirror above my dresser and see a stranger with my face. Her eyes were hollow, her skin was pale, and there was a haunted look about her. I started to think of my own body as a house that had been invaded, and the life growing inside me wasn't a baby. Not yet. It was the secret. A living, breathing secret that was stealing my breath, my food, my very self. My prayers, which had once been easy conversations with a loving God, became desperate, unanswered pleas whispered into my pillow. I felt like a photograph left out in the sun, the colors of who I used to be just fading and fading until only a faint outline was left. I was becoming the sick, strange girl my mother's silence told me I was. The cruelest twist, the thing that finally broke my spirit, wasn't the isolation itself. It was discovering the story my mother was telling on the other side of the door. One afternoon, she must not have closed the door completely. It was open just a crack, and I could hear voices from the parlor. It was Pastor Evans' wife, Mrs. Evans, and she was speaking in that soft, pitying tone people use for tragedies. I crept to the door, my heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the cool wood. "You are a saint, Martha," Mrs. Evans said. "Truly a saint on this earth. The way you are caring for this poor, troubled child. To bear such a cross with so much grace." I heard my mother make a soft, mournful sound. I heard her say, "It's God's will. We must pray for her. She has dark moods. She doesn't know what she's saying sometimes." The air left my lungs. A cross to bear. A troubled child. Dark moods. She wasn't just hiding me. She was performing. She was painting a masterpiece of maternal martyrdom for the whole town to see, and I was the ugly, hidden corner of the canvas. She was building her own sainthood on the foundation of my ruin. That was the moment the last bit of fight in me died. I realized I couldn't win. Every plea, every tear, every protest from me would only make her story more believable. The crazier I seemed, the more saintly she would look for enduring it. It was a perfect, beautiful, diabolical trap, so I stopped. I stopped calling out. I ate what was on the trays. I sat by the window and became the ghost she needed me to be. I surrendered to the silence. It was my white flag. I let it wrap around me like a shroud, because it was the only thing that was truly mine. The only place her lies and the town's pity couldn't reach. I know this is a dark place to be. It's hard to sit in this silence with me, but I need you to. I need you to understand how deep the quiet went. If you have the courage to keep listening, subscribe to my channel and stay with me, because I promise you, this silence wasn't the end. It was just the long, dark night before the first crack of dawn. Winter had fully settled over prosperity, burying the dead fields under a blanket of white. The silence of the snow mirrored the silence in our house. By then, my body was a map of my shame. There was no hiding the life that grew within me, and the weight of it, both real and imagined, was a constant, crushing burden. The silent war had ended because I had surrendered, but now a new tension filled the air, the dread of the inevitable. The secret was about to break out of the prison of my body and my room, and I lay awake at night, my heart a cold stone in my chest, wondering what would become of me when it did. I was teetering on the edge of a great dark canyon, and I was terrified of the fall. Then, something shifted. After weeks of nothing but cold trays and colder silence, my mother began to show me a strange, unnerving kindness. She left a small bunch of dried wildflowers on my dinner tray one evening. Another day, I heard her humming one of the old hymns again, just outside my door. It was a watery, thin sound, not like the full-throated humming I remembered, but it was something. One morning, she spoke to me through the door, her voice softer than I'd heard it in months. She told me that my father had to go to Topeka for the day to buy seed for the spring planting. She said she had to go into town herself, to the church, to help the ladies' auxiliary plan the Easter bake sale. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I would be alone in the house for a few hours. And then she said the words that made my heart stop. "I'll leave your door unlocked, Fawn, in case you need anything." Hope is a stubborn, foolish thing. Even in that dark place, a tiny flicker of it ignited in my chest. This was it, a chance. I didn't have a grand plan to run away. Where would a girl in my condition go? But there was a telephone in the parlor, a heavy black thing that could reach out across the miles. My Aunt Clara, my mother's sister, lived just 2 counties over. If I could just hear her voice, if I could just tell one person I wasn't okay, maybe I wouldn't feel so alone. The idea was terrifying, but the thought of doing nothing was worse. I waited, listening, until I heard the big engine of my father's truck rumble down the lane, and then the softer sound of my mother's footsteps on the porch, followed by the click of the front door. My heart was beating so hard it felt like a trapped bird against my ribs. I crept from my room, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors. The house felt huge and unfamiliar. Every shadow was a monster. Every creak of the floorboards was a gunshot. I made it to the parlor. The phone sat on a small table, dark and silent. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely lift the heavy receiver. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, the sound of a world I had been cut off from. I started to dial, my finger shaking as I pulled the rotary dial for the first number of Clara's exchange. "Who are you calling, Fawn?" The voice came from the kitchen doorway. I froze, the receiver still pressed to my ear. It was my mother. She hadn't gone anywhere. She had been waiting, hiding in the pantry, the whole time. The look on her face, it wasn't anger. It was so much worse. It was a look of cold, sorrowful victory, the look of someone whose lowest expectations have just been confirmed. "I prayed I was wrong about you," she said, her voice dripping with a false piety that turned my blood to ice. "I hoped that if I showed you trust, you would be worthy of it. I see now. The sickness in your mind is even deeper than I feared. It was a trap. The kindness, the unlocked door, the story about the bake sale. It was all a test. A cruel, vicious test designed for me to fail, to prove to her that I was a deceitful, ungrateful creature who had to be controlled. She hadn't been offering a lifeline. She had been testing the strength of my chain. She led me back to my room. There were no harsh words, no struggle. I was hollowed out, a shell of a girl. She didn't bother with the little hook-and-eye lock on the door this time. She didn't have to. The prison was inside me now, its walls built of her cruelty and my despair. I was hers to command. My fall into the abyss was complete. My submission was complete. I was a ship without a rudder, adrift on a sea of my mother's making, waiting for her to decide which shore I would crash upon. The baby was coming soon. Its movements under my ribs were a constant, rolling reminder that time was running out. The air in the house grew thick with a new kind of energy. The quiet dread was being replaced by my mother's focused, almost manic purpose. She was no longer just my jailer. She was now the director of a grand play, and I was her silent, unwilling star. One evening, she came into my room. It was the first time she'd sat down with me in months. She didn't look at my swollen belly. She looked right into my eyes, her own gaze clear and sharp as glass. And then she told me the story. She spoke in a calm, steady voice, as if she were explaining a recipe. She told me that God often chooses the humblest vessels for his greatest works. She said this child was not a mark of shame, but a sign from the heavens, sent to a town that had grown complacent in its faith. I was not a fallen girl. I was chosen. Like Mary, a miracle was growing inside me, and our family was to be its sacred guardian. She talked and talked, her words weaving a beautiful, holy tapestry to cover the ugly, jagged hole in our lives. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, a doll listening to her owner explain the new, terrible game we were about to play. I was too empty to fight. Her confidence, her absolute certainty in the righteousness of her lie made her arrogant. And in her arrogance, she made a mistake. To sanctify the story, to make it real in my mind and in God's eyes, she brought in the old family Bible. It was a huge, leather-bound book, heavy with the names and dates of Andersons long dead. "We will swear on this Bible," she said, her voice filled with a chilling reverence. "We will swear to honor this gift and tell the story as he has given it to us." She placed the heavy book on my lap. Its weight felt final. She made me place my hand on its worn cover and repeat her words, my own voice a dead whisper in the room. Then she left, leaving the Bible with me overnight, as if its presence alone could purify my soul. Later, in the dead of night, I couldn't sleep. I ran my fingers over the brittle pages. A corner of a yellowed envelope was sticking out from between the pages of the Psalms. My fingers trembled as I drew it out. It was a letter, dated 30 years earlier. The handwriting was my Aunt Clara's. It was written to my mother. My eyes scanned the faded ink, my heart beginning to pound a frantic, forgotten rhythm. It was about my mother, about how, when she was 17, she had found herself in trouble, about a boy who had left town, about a hasty marriage to my father, a good, simple man who asked no questions, about how their own mother, my grandmother, had arranged it all to avoid a shame that would have ruined them. The letter fell from my hands. The room tilted, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from understanding. My mother wasn't a monster. She was a ghost. She was living a nightmare that had happened to her once before. All this, the cage, the silence, the desperate, fantastical lie, it wasn't about protecting a doctor or even a family name. It was the frantic, terrified reaction of a woman trying to smother the fire of her own past before it could consume her daughter, too. She was trying to rewrite her own story through me, but giving it a holy ending this time instead of a shameful one. The knowledge didn't excuse her. The cruelty was still real, but it changed everything. It was a key, not to a door, but to her mind. For the first time in months, I felt something other than fear. It was a tiny, hard kernel of power. The letter was a dangerous truth. I could burn it, go back to being the broken doll, and let her play out her story. Or I could hold on to it, a secret of my very own. A single sharp stone in a world that had left me with nothing but smooth, suffocating walls. The choice felt like a spark in a tinderbox, and I didn't know if it would light my way out or burn us both to the ground. I didn't burn the letter. I folded it into a tiny, tight square and tucked it deep into the torn lining of my winter coat, which hung silently in the back of my closet. It was the first secret I'd ever kept from my mother, and the act of hiding it was the first stone I laid in a foundation for a freedom I couldn't yet imagine. For days, I played the part she had written for me. I was the quiet, submissive vessel, my eyes downcast, my voice soft. I let her tell me about how the town would rejoice, how people would come to see the miracle child. I nodded and agreed. For the first time, my silence was not a surrender. It was a strategy. I was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. I was a prisoner, yes, but I was studying the habits of my warden, waiting for a moment of distraction. My father was the only way out. He was a good man, a simple man, and he had been kept in the dark, pacified with my mother's stories of my illness. He loved me, I knew he did, but his trust in my mother was as solid and unquestioning as the earth he plowed. To reach him, I would have to pass through her. I waited for a Sunday, after she had read to me from the Bible, her voice full of false piety. I looked at her, my own eyes wide and clear, and told her that I accepted God's will, but that I needed my father's blessing to feel true peace. I needed to hear him say he wasn't ashamed of me. It was the perfect move. It fed her narrative of my spiritual acceptance, and it was a request so reasonable, so righteous, that she couldn't refuse without raising my father's suspicion. She brought him to my room that evening. She stayed, of course, a silent chaperone sitting in the corner, her knitting needles clicking like tiny, busy insects. My father stood by my bed, his big, work-roughened hands looking lost and clumsy. He patted my shoulder, his touch gentle. "Fawn," he began, his voice thick with a sorrow that wasn't mine. "Your mama told me. We have to trust in the Lord's plan." He was reciting her lines. My heart sank. This was going to be harder than I thought. "Daddy," I whispered, my eyes pleading with him. "Please, I need to talk to you. Alone." I saw a flicker of suspicion in my mother's eyes, but my father, bless his simple heart, just saw his daughter's plea. He looked at my mother. "Martha, just for a minute. Let me talk to my girl." Reluctantly, with a look that promised she would be just outside the door, my mother left. The moment the door closed, I spoke. The words a frantic whisper. "Daddy, it's a lie. All of it. Mama's lying." He recoiled as if I'd struck him. His face, which had been soft with pity, hardened with confusion and a touch of anger. "Don't you talk that way, Fawn," he said sternly. "Your mother has nearly broken herself caring for you. You are sick. You don't know what you're saying." This was the twist I hadn't prepared for. He wasn't just unaware, he was an unwilling guard at my prison door, convinced he was protecting me. He believed her, not me. Tears streamed down my face, but for the first time they were tears of fury, not despair. I reached into the pocket of the simple house dress I wore, my fingers closing around the tiny folded square of the letter. It was my only weapon, my last chance. I pushed it into his hand. "I'm not sick, Daddy. I'm scared. And she's scared too. Read this. It's from Aunt Clara, from 30 years ago. Please." I had to force my voice to be steady, to be sane. I had to become the person he could believe. He looked at the crumpled paper, then at me, then back at the paper. Hesitantly, he unfolded it, his brow furrowed as his eyes moved across the page. I watched his face change. The certainty crumbled, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. The color drained from his cheeks. He looked up from the letter, his eyes wide with a question he couldn't seem to voice. He opened his mouth to speak, my name a silent word on his lips. And in that exact moment, we heard the floorboards creak in the hall. My father moved faster than I'd ever seen him, shoving the letter deep into his trouser pocket an instant before the bedroom door swung open. My mother stood there, a tray with a glass of milk in her hands, her smile as thin as a razor's edge. "I thought you might be thirsty," she said. But her eyes weren't on the glass. They were darting between my tear-streaked face and my father's pale, stricken one. She knew. She didn't know what, but she knew a secret had just passed between us. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with the unspoken terror of discovery. My father, my mother, and me, the whole broken triangle of us, trapped in a silence that was about to explode. The moment after my mother left the room was the quietest I have ever known. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world hanging on a single, fragile thread. My father stood frozen for a long second, the letter a phantom weight in his pocket. Then he looked at me, and in his eyes I saw 30 years of simple, trusting love for his wife curdle into something new, a terrible, heartbroken wisdom. He didn't have the words for it. Men like my father, their hands speak for them. They build and they fix. And he was now facing something he could not build and could not fix. He just knelt by my bed, took my hand in his 2 big ones and whispered, "I'm sorry, Fawn. A man ought to see what's happening in his own house. I'm sorry." And in that moment, I wasn't alone anymore. But the price of his companionship was seeing my strong, steady father look so utterly broken. It was the first bitter taste of what freedom might cost. That night, the quiet war in our house finally found its voice. It wasn't a shouting match. It was a battle of whispers, fought in the kitchen after I was supposed to be asleep. I crept to my door and listened, my heart aching with every word. I heard my father's voice, low and wounded, and my mother's, sharp and defensive, weaving new lies to cover the old ones. It was a terrible, beautiful sound, the sound of the world I knew being torn down, brick by brick. I had started this. I had handed my father the hammer. The guilt and the relief were so tangled up inside me, I could barely breathe. The next day, my father did what a man like him does when he's been wronged. He acted. But he was a farmer, not a fighter. He didn't know how to attack a giant like Dr. Miller, a man who held our town in the palm of his hand. So he went for the only institution he felt he could touch. He went to the church. He didn't tell the whole story. He just walked into Pastor Evans' office, his face like a thundercloud, and told him that due to a private family matter, a crisis of faith, he was resigning his position as a deacon, effective immediately. To my father, it was a gesture of protest, a silent scream in a town that wouldn't listen. He came home looking grim, but resolute, as if he'd struck a meaningful blow against the injustice of it all. The real blow, however, landed somewhere else entirely. The plot twist wasn't what my father did, but the terrible, unintended ripple it caused. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was the pastor. His voice was strained, panicked. He told my father that his wife, the kind Mrs. Evans who had praised my mother's saintliness, had collapsed. She had a weak heart, something known only to a few. The shock of my father's angry, inexplicable resignation, the fear of a rift in the church she so loved, had been too much for her. An ambulance had been called. She was in a bad way. My father hung up the phone and slumped into a kitchen chair, his face ashen. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a fresh horror. "What have I done?" he whispered. "I was trying to... And now, that good woman." His words hit me harder than any of my mother's cruelties. I had wanted justice. I had prayed for a rescuer. And now, our first clumsy attempt at fighting back had wounded one of the few truly gentle souls in all of prosperity. My mother, seeing her chance, seized on it. "You see?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper from the doorway. "This is what happens. Your selfishness, your wicked stories. You're hurting innocent people. This is God's judgment on your lies." I felt the walls of the prison I'd just begun to dismantle start to rise up around me again, stronger than ever. But this time, the bars were made of my own guilt. I had to make a choice, right then, that felt heavier than life itself. Do I push my father to keep fighting, to tell the whole truth and risk a scandal so great it could break Mrs. Evans' fragile heart for good? Or do I silence him and myself to protect her? Do I crawl back into my cell and lock the door from the inside to stop my poison from spreading any further? The guilt over Mrs. Evans was a heavy cloak, and for a full day, it smothered the little spark of fight I had found. My mother's words echoed in my head, telling me I was a poison, a bringer of pain. I spent that night on my knees, but my prayer was different this time. I wasn't begging God to save me anymore. I was asking for the wisdom to know what was right. Not what was easy, but what was right. And in the deep, quiet hours of that night, an answer came to me, clear as a church bell on a cold morning. To retreat now, to bury the truth for the sake of a fragile peace, would be the greatest sin of all. It would mean letting my child be born into a lie. It would mean leaving a wolf to guard the sheep. And it would mean that the good, kind Mrs. Evans had collapsed for nothing. My pain had to have a purpose. The truth was a bigger thing than my fear, bigger than my mother's shame, bigger than anyone's comfort. The next morning, I found my father on the back porch, staring out at the fallow fields, looking like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. I stood beside him and said, "We have to finish it, Daddy." He looked at me, his eyes full of doubt and fear over what we'd already done. But seeing the new resolve in my own eyes, a calm certainty that hadn't been there before, seemed to give him a little piece of a backbone back. He just nodded, a single grim jerk of his head. We didn't have a plan. We just had a shared, unspoken pact. The house was filled with a strange, heavy calm all day. My mother watched us, her eyes narrowed slits of suspicion. She knew something had shifted. The three of us moved around each other like planets in a broken orbit, held together by a gravity of secrets and shame, about to spin ourselves apart. That evening, my mother played her final card. It was the most brilliant, most cruel move she had left. She came into my room, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked at me with what seemed to be real, gut-wrenching sorrow. Her face was crumpled with tears, her body shaking with sobs. She collapsed at the foot of my bed and confessed everything. The story from the letter, the boy who left her, the shame, the hasty marriage. She framed it as a mother's desperate, misguided love. "I was just trying to protect you, Fawn," she wept, clutching my hand, her tears hot on my skin. "I couldn't bear to see you ruined like I was. I just wanted to give you a miracle instead of a scar. Please, baby, forgive me. Let's just stop this. We can still have the miracle. We can be a family again." It was a masterwork of manipulation, an appeal to the part of me that still loved her, the daughter who wanted to believe her mother wasn't a monster. The old me would have shattered. I would have taken her in my arms and agreed to anything to stop her pain. But I looked at her desperate, tear-streaked face, and I saw the lie for what it was. It was just another cage, the prettiest one yet, lined with velvet and pity, but a cage all the same. I pulled my hand away, my own voice coming out clear and steady, a stranger's voice. "No, Mama," I said, my heart breaking as I did it. "The lying is over." She stared at me, her tears stopping as if a faucet had been turned off. The sorrow in her eyes hardened back into that familiar, cold fury. She knew she had lost. She left my room without another word. A great, terrifying calm washed over me. The final thread was cut. I knew what I had to do. The confrontation couldn't be with her. The sickness hadn't started with her. She was just its most tragic symptom. I walked out of my room and found my father sitting in the dark parlor, waiting. He looked up as I entered, and he didn't need to ask. He could see it on my face. "Daddy," I said, my voice not shaking at all, "I need you to take me into town. It's time I paid a visit to Dr. Miller." The drive into town was a journey through a foreign land. The familiar storefronts of prosperity were dark and strange, their windows like vacant eyes. Every mile that drew us closer to Dr. Miller's house, I felt the baby move inside me, a silent passenger on the most terrifying trip of my life. My father didn't speak. He just drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw set like stone. He parked the truck down the street from the Miller house, as if to hide our old, mud-splattered farm truck from its pristine world. The house was the grandest on the block, a big white two-story with dark green shutters, pillars on the porch, and a perfect, manicured lawn. It looked like a picture of decency. It looked like a lie. My father walked beside me up the stone path, his presence a solid, warm wall against the cold night air. I felt small and fragile next to him, but his quiet strength flowed into me. He was my witness. I would not face the monster alone. I lifted my hand, and it was his strength, not my own, that knocked on that heavy oak door. The woman who opened it was his wife, Mrs. Miller. She stood there, framed in the warm yellow light of her perfect home, looking at me, at my swollen belly, her face a mask of cold, elegant disgust. Before she could speak, the doctor himself appeared behind her. He was in a smoking jacket, a book in one hand, the very picture of a man at peace in his castle. His smile was warm and welcoming until he saw me. Then it faltered, just for a second, before being plastered back into place. "Fawn, Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "What a surprise. Is everything all right?" He was trying to take control, to frame us as the hysterical patients arriving at his doorstep. "We need to talk to you, doctor," my father said, his voice a low rumble. We were in his parlor. It was filled with dark wood and leather chairs, smelling of pipe tobacco and old paper. It was the heart of his kingdom. I stood in the center of the room, my father a step behind me, my own personal guard. "Dr. Miller," I began, my voice clearer than I ever dreamed it could be. "I'm here so you can see what you've done." He tried to gaslight me one last time. "My dear girl," he said, his face a mask of deep concern, "you are clearly not well. The strain of your condition. Your mother and I have been so worried." He looked past me to my father. "Frank, this is a private matter. Your daughter is confused." "She is not confused," my father said, stepping forward. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a hammer blow. "And you will listen to her." I looked that man, that pillar of our town, right in the eye. "You raped me," I said, "in your office, on a Tuesday in October. And this child that my mother calls a miracle, this child is yours." The silence that followed was absolute. The doctor's face went pale. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. He was cornered. He was beaten. And just when I thought he might finally confess, the most terrible thing happened. The plot twist wasn't his confession. It was his wife's. Mrs. Miller, who had been standing silent as a statue, let out a short, bitter laugh. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was breathtaking. "You foolish, foolish little girl," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking at me. "Did you really think you were the first? Did you think you were special?" She took a step closer. "My husband is a great man. Great men have appetites. They have moments of weakness. My job, the job of a loyal wife, is to protect him from insignificant little tramps like you who cry assault every time you're given a moment of attention." The air was sucked from my lungs. It was a confession, but it was also a condemnation. She admitted everything, not to grant me justice, but to rob me of my own story, to reduce my violation to a footnote in a long, sordid history of his appetites and her complicity. She was the keeper of his secrets, the cleaner of his messes. He wasn't just a monster. They were a team. We left without another word. What was there to say? My father put his arm around me and guided me out of that perfect, poisoned house. The truth was out, but it wasn't the clean, righteous truth I had prayed for. It was a filthy, tangled thing, dragged into the light only to reveal how much deeper the darkness ran. I had my confession, but it felt like a curse. As we drove away in silence, leaving that monument of lies gleaming in the dark, I knew the confrontation was over. But the real battle, the one for my own soul, was just about to begin. The ride home was a silent wake. The ugly truth sat between my father and me, a third passenger in the cab of his truck. We had won, I suppose. We had faced the monster and torn off his mask, only to find his wife wearing another one just beneath it. When we walked into our own house, my mother was waiting in the kitchen. She looked at our faces, and she knew. She knew her story was dead. My father spoke, and his voice was not the voice of the quiet man I'd known my whole life. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed past the edge of his own world. "It's over, Martha," he said, his voice low and heavy as stone. "There will be no more lies in this house. This is Fawn's home, and that baby is my grandchild. We will not live your story. We will live the truth." My mother didn't scream or cry or argue. All the fight just drained out of her. She seemed to shrink right there in the middle of her own kitchen, becoming a small old woman, her magnificent fortress of lies having crumbled into dust around her. She simply turned and walked to her bedroom, closing the door behind her, and in a way, she never really came out again. I thought the days that followed would be filled with planning our next move, with strategy and anger. But the final, most surprising twist in my story wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of grace. The morning after the confrontation, my father went out to his workshop. I heard the sound of a handsaw, the rasp of sandpaper on wood. He worked all day. He didn't speak a word. That evening, he brought it into the house. It was a cradle. He had spent the entire day building a cradle from pale, smooth-grained pine. It was simple and strong and beautiful. He placed it in the corner of my room, and the scent of freshly cut wood filled the air, chasing away the old, stale smells of sickness and fear. For months, my child had been a secret, a shame, a concept, a miracle. In all that time, no one had performed a single, practical act for the real baby who was about to enter the world. This cradle, this was the true miracle. It was a declaration, spoken not in words, but in wood and love. It said, "You are welcome here, you are real, you will be loved." In that moment, I knew the war was over. The goal was no longer to tear down the Miller's world. The goal was to build my sons. Dr. Miller died of a heart attack nearly 20 years later, a town hero to the very end. His obituary praised his decades of selfless service. Mrs. Miller lived on for many more years, a bitter widow rattling around in that big, perfect house, becoming a ghost in her own life, a far more fitting punishment than any I could have devised. And my mother, she lived with us for the rest of her life, a quiet, faded presence. We were kind to each other, but the bridge between us was gone forever. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, her secrets buried with her. I named my son David. He grew up in the house his grandfather owned, rocked in the cradle his grandfather built. The whispers in town about the miracle baby eventually faded into a quirky piece of local folklore people half remembered. David grew into a good and gentle man, a man with my father's quiet strength. Sometimes I look at his hands, and for a fleeting moment I see the doctor's hands, and the old wound aches. But it's just a scar now, a reminder of a battle I survived. My victory wasn't a public confession or a courtroom drama. My victory was every lullaby I sang to my son. It was every meal my father and I shared with him at our kitchen table. It was the quiet, stubborn, day-by-day act of building a life of love on a foundation of violence. I learned that justice doesn't always come like a thunderclap. Sometimes it comes in the scent of sawdust. Sometimes your greatest act of defiance is to simply live, and to live well. This is how I took back my life, by choosing to build a cradle when the world told me I should be digging a grave for my reputation. If my story has moved you, please, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to know that survival is its own form of justice. Every voice that speaks a hard truth makes the world a little brighter. I'm still here, and I want to hear what you think. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know how far my little story from Prosperity, Kansas has traveled. And please, subscribe to my channel. There are more stories in this old heart of mine left to tell.